Welcome, everybody. Just a few moments. Thank you. Okay, nice. Just a couple seconds before 9 a.m. All right, everybody, it's 9 a.m. Thank you so much, guys, for being here. So I'm just getting the lecture going now. Hope everybody slept well and having a good first week of classes. And so let's just dive right into our topics here. As you guys know, you can interact anytime in this interface here using either the chat, your microphones, cameras, or any other combination of those things. So as we go through it, if you have any questions, comments, reactions, anything at all, feel free to just intervene and get involved. But let me go ahead and just start developing our first notes for our first course meeting here. So as you guys know, it's Intro to Philosophy. And I thought maybe it would be worthwhile to start by just saying something about the word philosophy itself. Maybe some of you have heard before about what the word means if you kind of analyze its roots and its etymology. But if you don't, then I'll try to make it clear for us right now. So that's the word philosophy. Anybody know about this? Like how it sort of translates if you go way back to the Greek roots of the word? No guesses. It's fine if you don't know. That's obviously what I'll teach you if you don't know it. But sometimes it's background knowledge in somebody's mind. I give you a chance to say if you know it. Nothing. Okay. Well, here we go.
It's
okay, David. Yeah.
It's Greek. It's philo, meaning knowledge, and Sophia, meaning love. So the love of knowledge in Greek.
Yes, almost perfect. Just flipped around. So philia is to love, and Sophia is wisdom.
I knew that. Yep.
Yeah, no, you're good. So like, here we go. Philia is the first part of the term from Greek. So this comes from the word philia, which is to love. And Sophia, well, let me put the bracket above it. This translates to Sophia, which is wisdom. So, a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. Philia, like a bibliophile, a person that loves books. Audiophile, a person that loves sound or music. So, philosophy really literally means the love of wisdom, and a philosopher would be a lover of wisdom. And so that's kind of interesting, I think, because if you really look at it, that means that built right into the core definition of the term philosophy is this kind of like passionate pursuit of knowledge and wisdom in the attitude of love. Many other academic disciplines have some kind of root at the end having to do with the word logos, which means like the logic of something, like so biology, the logic of life systems. And so it is unique and kind of interesting that philosophy has this concept of passion and love at the heart of pursuing wisdom and knowledge. And in the ancient Greek world, philosophy was like the master academic discipline from which all the others branched off and descended. So it really has deep historical roots in the whole intellectual and academic tradition of the West. So what philosophers then do is they pursue questions about of deep human significance, pursuing wisdom in all these different areas. Wisdom about what it is to know something, wisdom about whether or not God exists or how we could know that, wisdom about the concept of ethics or the mind. And so we will now embark on our own little journey into philosophy, taking a tour through some of the big major subject areas and some of the deep questions that have been pondered and puzzled over for thousands of years by these lovers of wisdom. Okay, so the first topic that we're going to launch in this class, we have several different subject areas in philosophy. Just how in science you got, chemistry, biology, physics. There's many different subject topics in philosophy too. And one of them, the first one that we are looking at, which is first in our book, is the philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion, that's our first topic here. And in the philosophy of religion, we ask questions about the existence of God, the nature of God, the justification of religious belief or lack thereof. And so we will now actually examine some of the biggest, most powerful arguments that have ever been written in the West that try to make the case that God exists. So we will take a survey of 3 major arguments that try to prove that God exists, and we'll also look at criticisms and objections to them. And that's something I'd like to also mention as we just get started in the class. Philosophy is known for that, for presenting you with arguments on either side of any kind of contested philosophical issue or claim. So in a similar way with law, you have a prosecutor and a defense attorney, and they're making the case to the jury on opposite sides of this question, whether the accused individual is guilty or not. And in philosophy, in the same way, we kind of make arguments on either side of important questions, like, does God exist? Is there such a thing as the soul? Is this the proper account of right and wrong? Or, what is the nature of time? So that's going to be our kind of method as we pursue the whole course. You'll always be treated to a balanced menu of arguments on both sides of whatever the question may be. So while we will read and learn about arguments that God exists, we'll also consider criticisms and objections to those. And in the end, you, the individual, just kind of use your own judgment to sort through which of the arguments you found to be more powerful, more compelling, more rationally persuasive. So philosophy of religion. Now, when it comes to religion in everyday life and in philosophical studies of it, there are 3 major kinds of category of belief that people can have, or there are 3 major positions that somebody can take on the question of God and God's existence. So 3 main positions. In the philosophy of religion. And not even just in the philosophy of religion. That's why I hesitated to write it, because it's really just 3 major positions on the question of whether God exists, which people can consider whether they have ever studied philosophy or not. So the 3 major categories are, you have people which are identified as theists, okay? You have people that are identified as atheists. And then there's a 3rd possible category that people talk about, which is the agnostics. So some of these terms are probably familiar to many of us, and if they're not, we'll definitely make sure they're clear before we're done here. But let me see if anybody can help me with a general idea behind some of these words. What do you think is a theist, or what's the definition of that? Like, if a person is a theist, what does that mean? That they what? Cameron? Yeah, sure.
That God does exist.
Right. So yes, a theist is a person that believes God exists. Okay, so believes that God exists. So those are theists, and just if you looked at statistical tables, you would see that the majority of all human beings on the planet are in some version of theism. Theism, as defined here, doesn't necessarily mean one specific variety of religious practice. So it's not just, for example, that like Christians are theists, or only Christians and Muslims or Jews. It's all of these different categories. Any individual that professes to believe in some kind of divine creator God is a theist. So that's a common thread throughout all the different world religions, the belief of theism. Some people, though, are not theists. And as an example, atheists are not theists. So maybe you have a general idea of this. It's a common word, I think. But what is an atheist? Anybody know that?
Someone who doesn't believe that God exists.
Yes, that's right. So they do not believe that God exists. Correct. Okay, so some people are not persuaded that God exists. They may have skepticism for a variety of reasons. Maybe they think the evidence isn't clear enough. Maybe they think that the concept of God is itself somehow contradictory. Maybe they've experienced hardships and they've become, it's a minority. I think in our country, it's something of 80+% of people are some version of a theist, but there is a contingent of people that are atheists. And I've actually heard that it's growing at a faster rate than perhaps in previous generations right now in the 21st century. There's also agnostics. Now, let me just say this. Some people think that agnosticism is really just a subcategory of atheism, but I think it's distinct enough to justify a third category. Anybody have even a vague idea of what an agnostic could possibly be? Maybe?
Someone who thinks there's not enough evidence to prove whether or not God exists.
Yes, perfect. Yes, that's correct. So that is a person that kind of, you can sort of see them as in between because they neither affirm nor deny whether there's a God. They take no view on the matter, I guess you could say. And it is because of what you said, because they think there's not enough evidence to prove or to disprove that God exists. So I'm just going to have to move over there for just 1 second, but I'll put the definition. And so an agnostic, suspends judgment, so like they don't judge affirmatively or negatively. And that is because of a perceived lack of sufficient evidence. Okay, so agnostics. Eddie, that's my cat. If you just heard him meow, maybe he'll show up in a minute. Don't worry, Eddie. Okay, yeah, so agnostic. Suspends judgment because of a perceived lack of evidence. This type of person would say, the jury's out. I don't know. I can't say whether I believe or disbelieve based on the current state of the evidence or what is intuitive. Now, when some argue that agnosticism is not a true third category, they would say that because they think of it as this is still something other than an affirmative belief in God. So some people just starkly categorize it as binary. Like you either have a belief in God or you just don't. And if you don't, even if it's not because you think there's enough evidence either way, you're still not a believer. But in traditional discussions, it's usually divided into these three categories. So now our topic is to focus on what have been the best arguments that have ever been produced by people in any of these various different categories. Like, so what are the best, what are the best arguments that can be produced by those that believe God exists to try and make a case that God exists? What are criticisms that atheists and others have made against those arguments? And we'll just try to, survey the whole terrain and the whole landscape intellectually here of what the arguments have been throughout history on this question. So I can now clear the board and we'll start to build up our notes on the first major argument for God's existence that we're studying here. We're going to study a couple of different ones, some of the big important ones, and this one comes first. So it was written by a man named Saint Anselm. So that's the author for the reading. Saint Anselm, interesting person. He lived like 1,000 years ago. He was born in 1033 and he died in 1109. So those are just the dates of his life, about 1,000 years ago. This is 2021, obviously. 22, thank you. Still getting used to that. Didn't time kind of just freeze anyway during the pandemic? A week, a month, a year, it's all the same. But anyway, 1033 to 1109. And in 1077, he wrote an important book, which is called the Proslogion. Okay. Need a little room? Sorry, thank you. The Proslogion. So that's a book by St. Anselm, 1077. In that book, we first see this written argument called the Ontological Argument. Okay, so this is the name of the argument from Anselm's writing that we will now be studying and trying to master. Okay? Eddie, come on. The Ontological Argument. Let me type it one time into the chat too, just so you can see the spelling clearly if it's not already. Okay, Ontological Argument, St. Anselm of Canterbury. So he was actually a scholar, a religious thinker, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is like an important political position at the time. So he was a well-known figure and a church scholar. And then after he died, due to his writings and contributions to the church, he was canonized as a saint in the Christian church. So that's why he has the title of Saint Anselm. You know that the Catholic and Protestant church schism happened much later than this. So at this time, it wasn't in the Catholic tradition of saints, but just the Christian church. Anyway, the Ontological Argument from the Proslogion by St. Anselm. That's our goal here, to master it. Now, the word ontological also has a root meaning in the beginning, ontos, which has to do with being or existence. So this is an argument that God exists based on what type of being he is believed to be and what kind of definition is associated with him. So now, let's go ahead and get into the details. Okay, so before I say more, let me just make one last point. This argument is not based on empirical evidence at all. So the word empirical evidence, let's try and focus on it for just a second. What is empirical evidence? Does anybody have a view on that or a background knowledge? It's a certain type of evidence, but what is it overall, or what is the general characterization of empirical evidence? Because I'm saying this argument's not based on any empirical evidence. So what could that be? What is it when it's empirical? Thoughts, views, nothing? Nothing for me? It's okay though. So let me say, all right, empirical evidence is actually just evidence that you can observe with the five senses. So it's kind of like physical evidence in a way, if you want to say that. Evidence that can be observed by the five senses. Okay, so the five senses: sight, taste, touch, hearing, smell. Empirical evidence is evidence that you could examine using the senses themselves. And so here's an example, like, do we know that dinosaurs existed? Pretty much, yes. And what's the evidence? Is there evidence? What is it? Let me know.
Bones.
The actual bones, right? We've recovered the fossils. We've, assembled them into their original form, carbon dated them. That's hard physical evidence that these dinosaurs existed. So that would be like empirical evidence, evidence that is discovered in the field and, examined physically and observed. But this argument for God's existence, the ontological argument, it's not based on that. So it's not like Anselm says, hey, you want to know if God exists? Well, look at this. I found like this shred of fabric somewhere, in the world. And if you look at it under a microscope, you will just see the signature of God is right there. It's not like that. So it's not based on anything, that you could just see, taste, touch, hear, or smell. It's an argument that's rather based on concepts and ideas alone. So it's based on just pure logic and definitions. So you can just understand the argument sitting in your chair. You do not have to get up and go out and empirically investigate the world at all. Now, I don't want anybody to have a bias against the argument just on that account alone. You might think, well, if there's no empirical evidence, then the argument's weak. But it's possible to have very good conceptual arguments that are just based on concepts. And so, anyway, that's what this argument is like. Now let's start to get into the more in-depth discussion of it in particular. Okay, so the first thing that Anselm does to start his discussion in the essay is he asks the reader to consider what is the nature of God? What is the characteristic features or attributes that are often commonly associated with God? So let's go ahead and try and figure out what those could be together. So when you think about God, if you ever do, what kind of qualities do you think of God as having if God existed? Like God would be what sort of being? I'm talking about, yeah?
An all good, all powerful, all knowing being.
Oh yeah, very good. So you just kind of knocked it out of the park. You gave us 3 of the big 4 criteria right there. So did anybody know the words for some of those things? Like all powerful?
Like omnipresent,
yes, good.
Omniscient.
Mm-hmm. Yes, all right, good. So we've got those words. Let me add them to the board. So one word that defines God is what is called omnipotent. Oh, you got it. Omniscient is another one, and also omnipresent. So we'll get those. But I'm starting with this because it's usually the first to mention. Omnipotent means all-powerful. Infinitely powerful. So omni means all, potency has to do with power. So having all power, all imaginable, just infinite, unlimited power. So the God is thought of as a being that could do anything through his will, and there's nothing that's beyond the powers of God. So could create and destroy a universe or make any state of affairs occur. So God is thought to be all-powerful, not limited in his power, not somehow missing some ability in terms of power. Another one is, as you mentioned, David, and some others, omniscience. omniscient. Okay, and that means all-knowing. So not only that God just has the power to do anything, but he also has all the possible knowledge of everything from the smallest little details to the grandest scale of reality. Nothing is a mystery or hidden from God, so God's all-knowing. And that also comes from two root words, omni meaning all, and from Latin, scientia, which is the word for knowledge. That's also the word from which the word science derives. So omniscient, all-knowing. And then the other big two, all-powerful, all-knowing. Let me go over there for those. There's all good. So that's omnibenevolent. And that just means all good, like all morally good and righteous and just to an infinite degree. And then finally, we've got also omnipresent. And omnipresent refers to being all present. So, like being in all places, in all times, and not being absent from any place or time. So like me and you, we're not omnipresent. Like right now I'm in Long Beach, I guess you're probably in Orange or whatever, and we're in different places. But God, they say, is everywhere all the time. There's nowhere that he's not present. And then in terms of time, we're also not present throughout all of time. I was born in the 80s, pretty old at this point. You guys were born later than that, but we haven't existed forever. If you go back 100 years, where were we? We weren't there. And so we have limits in time and space, but God, they think, according to common understanding of him, is everywhere all the time, perfectly good, totally powerful, and knows everything. Now, when you distill all these qualities down to like a concise statement, what Anselm believes you arrive at is the idea that God is just overall thought of as the greatest conceivable being. Okay, and that's the key phrase in his paper. So what all this adds up to and amounts to basically is the greatest conceivable being. Okay, the greatest conceivable being, the being that's greater than any other being you could possibly think of. So conceivable means like what you would be able to imagine or think of in your mind. And so if God is the idea of an infinitely powerful, knowledgeable, moral, and present being, then that's the idea of a being that is the greatest you could ever imagine. No one could imagine a being greater than God. And even though that's an easy enough way to say it, the greatest conceivable being, Anselm, at times in his writing, puts it in a more confusing idiom, so I don't want that to throw you off very much. But the way he will sometimes say it is this, that the greatest conceivable being, his chosen phrase is often this phraseology, that it is the being than which, see, that's just an odd turn of phrase for a modern speaker, but anyway, the being than which none greater can be conceived. Okay, so the first move in his essay, in his argument, is to try and set forth the common definition of God, and it's basically the greatest conceivable being, or in his perhaps awkward phrase, the being than which none greater can be conceived. You see, this is just a comparative. Like God is the being than which, if you compare him to other beings, none other could be conceived of as greater. Okay, now, who do you think he is going to say has this idea of God in their mind? We talked about theists, atheists, agnostics. Whom has the idea of God as the greatest conceivable being? What do you think is his answer? Because he says this idea is in the mind of people. But which people? The idea of God as the greatest conceivable being is in whose mind?
Theists.
Theists, okay, Tariq, yes. But even more so, he says, it's not only theists who at least have this definition of God, it even includes, who do you think I'm fishing around for here?
Is it agnostic?
Yes, but let's go all the way. Not even just the agnostics. Even who else?
Atheist?
Atheists, yes. Now, understand what I'm telling you here. He doesn't say atheists believe in God, but he is saying that atheists understand the definition of the word God. And, if you understand the definition, then you at least have the concept in your head. Like God, the thought anyway, is the idea of the greatest conceivable being. Now, it may seem like a small point, but it's something that is important to his argument. He really wants us to understand that it's not only theists that have this comprehension of the idea of God, it's everybody all together. So theists and atheists don't disagree, therefore, on what the definition of God is. They just disagree on what point? Can anyone say that? A theist and an atheist can sort of shake hands and be like, okay, that's the idea anyway of God. Yes, greatest conceivable being. But what divides them?
Whether it exists in
Yes,
like
whether that
reality or
being,
not.
yes, whether the being with that definition is real or not, whether it really exists or not. Okay, good. So he starts us off by saying the definition of God is universally understood and accepted. That the idea of God is understood by all people as the greatest conceivable being. Now let me read some of his words now that I've tried to explain it to you in my way, and you'll hear the author's presentation of the same. Again, it's 1,000 years old. You know, this is old-fashioned writing, so just you got to deal with that. But on page 15, he starts and he's addressing himself to God. So he says, well then, Lord, you who give understanding to faith, grant me that I may understand as much as you see fit, that you exist as we believe you to exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now, we believe that you are something than which nothing greater could be thought. Or could it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist? And now he quotes from the scriptures in Psalms where it says, because the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Now he continues and he says, but surely when this same fool hears what I'm speaking about, okay, pause. When he's using the term fool, borrowing from the phrase in the scriptures, he's using it as a label to refer to atheists and non-believers. It's maybe not the nice, generous label to use, but that's what he means. So he says, so surely when the same fool hears what I'm speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. Okay, so he's just saying there, the fool says in his heart there's no God, but at least the person who says this still understands what the word means and what it's referring to in concept. Now, after that, he makes mention of how there are some things that exist only in the mind, but then there are other things that exist in both the mind and also in reality. And I want us to try and think about that for a moment and come up with some fair examples of each kind of thing. So, okay, so like exists only in the mind. And then on the other hand, exists in both the mind and in reality. Okay, so starting off here, things that exist only in the mind. So let me have some examples from any of you guys, and what I'm kind of asking for are things that are not real, that are like made up fictional things. It could be fantasy, items or beings, things that we can think of, but they're not actually in the real reality. Like what?
Unicorn.
Okay, good. That's a very good example. That's the example I'm kind of looking for. So like one could be a unicorn. A unicorn, the mythical horse with a horn protrudes from its forehead. This is not a real animal. It's just a mythical creature. And so it's only in your mind. You won't find one outside of your mind out in the field. So that's one. What's another thing that's kind of like the unicorn, but just a different example? It could be anything from fiction, film, that's not even real, but you got to...
Fairies?
You said who?
Fairies?
Fairies, okay, good. Like the little mythical medieval fairies from those old stories and stuff. Yes, that's another one. Tooth fairy or otherwise. Sure, those are not real. Anybody else have a few favorites? Got fairies.
Cthulhu?
Cthulhu from the old H.P. Lovecraft. That's a very that's a good reference. Yes, I'm not sure if I'm going to spell it right. Let's just suppose that's how you spell it, because I know it's like C-T-H-U-L or whatever. But yeah, I can't remember all the details, but it's like this kind of weird octopus-like sort of beast or whatever, monster from H.P. Lovecraft stories. Any other random shout-outs on the only existing in the mind stuff?
Like
Mermaids?
Who? What? Sorry, I didn't hear. I bet.
Leprechaun.
Danny DeVito?
Leprechauns. Well, Danny DeVito's real. Come on. But yeah.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah, anyway. Fan of Always Sunny, I guess. I mean, yeah, Danny DeVito's been around for a long time.
Huge fan.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. So yeah, anyway, though, unicorns, fairies, Cthulhu, the leprechaun. I mean, whatever, dragons, the X-Men. So those are things that exist only in the mind, not in actual reality. On the other hand, now this is going to be a little weird, but easy enough to do. Like, what are things that exist in the mind? Like, you can think of them right now, but they're also out in reality. Like, they're not just only figments of your imagination. So anything at all can fit the bill here. But any guys gotta go ahead?
A butterfly?
A butterfly, yeah. So like those are real things. Now that's a category of things. It's a species of things, which is fair. Can anyone give me examples too of like a particular object or being that's out there in reality?
A chair?
A chair. Once again, it's a category though. Like I was trying to hope for like specific
Danny
examples.
DeVito.
A rocking chair?
Danny DeVito's fine now. Chair. Well, is rocking chair still a category? Like you got to say Joe the rocking chair. Like it's something specific. But anyway, butterfly, chair, DeVito, if you want. Like I'm thinking, Statue of Liberty, Eiffel Tower, the moon, planet Mars. Those things are real. They're not just made up ideas in your head. If you didn't even have mind with any thoughts, they would still exist. Okay, so notice this. There's some things they only exist in the mind. Some things, though, they exist in both the mind, but they're also real. Now, between those two kinds of things, what do you think would be greater, to exist merely in the mind or to additionally exist in reality? Like, what's greater? Do we exist only in the mind or in both?
In both.
It's both. That's right. I mean, that's Anselm's point. He says it's just evidently true that it's greater to exist in both, because to exist in both means you have as much reality as these imaginary things do, but on top of it, you also have the real reality of being in the physical world. So according to Anselm's reasoning here, it's just greater for something to exist in both the mind and in reality than it is to only exist in the mind. So now let's go back to the definition of God. What did he say that definition was to all people? Defined as what? Question, just let me know. God defined to be the what being?
A being than which nothing greater can be thought.
Can be thought, right, yeah. So just the greatest conceivable being. So according to that definition, and this idea that it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality, what would God have to do to be the greatest conceivable being? He would have to then what? You have a comparison. Exist in both the mind and in reality. Why? Because that's greater. And so in case God only existed in the mind, like a leprechaun or a tooth fairy or something, if he was just one of these fake things that are made up, then he would not be what? He would not be the greatest conceivable being, because that is less great than a being that it also exists in reality too. So he thinks that's the conclusion. God has to exist in the mind and reality just based on the definition of God, and then this secondary point that it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than to exist in the mind alone. And he thinks that you would actually contradict yourself if you said God does not exist in reality, because it would be like saying the greatest conceivable being is not as great as you could possibly imagine. Okay, so his leverage point is getting us to all agree that the definition of God is the greatest conceivable being. And for him, it's just a few steps from that definition to the conclusion that he exists. The bridge that he builds from the definition to that conclusion is that it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than in only the mind. So if God's definition, which everyone accepts according to him, is greatest conceivable being, then that implies that he would have to be in the greater category of these two things, namely something that's also real. Okay, now let me read his words on the point, and you can see him say it. He says this. So it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. Thus, and he gives an example, I'll just set this up for you. He talks about a painter who has an idea for a painting in his mind, but has not yet set out to paint it on the canvas. So before the painting happens, this painting is just an idea. After he actually executes it, though, it has this additional feature of being a real painting, not just something that was a thought process. So he says here, therefore, when a painter plans beforehand what he's going to paint, he has the picture in his mind, but he does not yet think that it actually exists because he has not yet painted it. However, when he has actually painted it, then he both has it in his mind and understands that it exists because now he has made it exist. Even the fool, then, again, atheist, is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, since he understands this when he hears it, and whatever is understood is in the mind. So he says, that much is agreed to by all. God at least exists in the mind. So the question then is, does he also exist in reality? And he says, surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. And now here's a key passage. Because if it exists only in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. If then, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, this same that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. Okay, so that's the presentation of his argument in his words, that God has to exist in the mind and in reality on the simple basis that he's universally regarded as the greatest conceivable being, and it would be less than greatest conceivable if he only existed in the mind, since it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality than mind by itself. There's a sort of tactic of argument that's been used here by Anselm in the paper, and I want to kind of clue you in onto what the terminology is for that. So the type of argument stratagem that he's using is sometimes referred to as reductio ad absurdum. And reductio ad absurdum, it's in Latin translates to reduce to absurdity, but it's a specific way of trying to generate a conclusion in argument. And here's how it kind of works. You assume the opposite of what you would like to prove. Assume the opposite of what you would like to prove, and then show that this leads to something absurd or impossible or contradictory. So what I'm writing here, and I'll say it too, assume the opposite of what you would like to prove, and then show that this leads to something absurd or ridiculous or contradictory. So suppose, for example, I want to prove to you that the planet Earth is not flat, and I hope we can all agree that it's not flat, but suppose I'm dealing with a person who doesn't agree on this, and I'm trying to convince them through argument, rationally. So I say, my good friend, the Earth isn't flat. You say it is. Now let me try and do a reductio to prove my point. So I'm the one arguing in favor of the hypothesis it's not flat. According to the reductio method, what would be my first move in trying to prove my point? I would say, let us assume for the sake of argument the contrary of what I wish to prove. So tell me what would be my assumption in this hypothetical example. I'm trying to prove it's not flat. So for the moment,
Assume the Earth is flat.
correct, yes. Assume it's flat just for the sake of argument. And if it was, what ridiculous or absurd things would that imply? If it was really flat, then that, of course, would imply the ridiculous result that what? Can anybody tell me what weird and absurd things would be implied by the hypothesis the Earth was flat?
We could fall off the end of it.
Yeah, if it was flat, then we should have documented cases of objects falling off the edge of the disk of the Earth. Furthermore, you'd have to assume on that assumption, if it's flat, that means that all the existing photos that have been taken by satellites and other orbiting objects, that they're just somehow sophisticated fakes. You'd also have to suppose that there's no difference in what part of the Earth is shown by the sunlight, because if this was a flat disk, then it would all be exposed to the light of the sun at the same time. And so you can only really explain the fact that there are different time zones where it's dark in some parts of the world, light in others, on the basis that it's a rotating spherical surface on its axis. So anyway, assuming that the Earth is flat leads us to ridiculous conclusions, like that things would fall off, or that we live in a world of fake satellite imagery, or that the satellites we have don't work by any understood mechanism, because of course they fall in a smooth elliptical orbit around the Earth. So on the assumption that it's flat, we get led to absurdity. Therefore, we can safely conclude that it is not flat. Okay, so when you assume the contrary of what you want to prove, like you take your opponent's point of view for the sake of argument, and then you show that it leads to something absurd, that is sufficient to prove your side of the case. Now, in Anselm's argument here, he's out to show us that God does not only exist in the mind, like, you know, like Santa Claus or something. He does not only exist in the mind, he exists in the mind and in reality. So he says, let us assume or suppose, just for the sake of discussion, that God does only exist in the mind. And now what absurd or ridiculous thing is that supposed to imply? If God really only existed in the mind, then tell me what's the absurdity that he's trying to tell us. If he was only in the mind.
People follow beliefs that have no purpose, I guess. Like they do all these things to try to get into heaven when like it doesn't exist.
Well, not so much that, although I know what you mean. You could say that if God didn't exist, then it would sort of mean that our, religious practices and stuff are without ultimate justification. But something more fundamental in line with what we've presented here. If God was only in the mind, then he would not.
Then he wouldn't be the greatest being.
Yes, then he would not count as the greatest conceivable being, because as we've shown, it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality. So on the supposition that God only exists in the mind, he's not the greatest conceivable being, which is supposed to be an absurd contradiction, because it is a contradiction to the definition of God that is universally accepted. So that's the first part of Anselm's presentation and argument. But there's a little bit more. Now, in my own opinion, if he had just kind of stopped right there, maybe his argument would have even been a little stronger, because I think that the way that he extends it from here, it's a little more controversial and so on, but we'll have to learn this too. So the next thing he says is that on top of God being the sort of being that has to exist in the mind and in reality, because that's greater, he cannot even be thought not to exist. Okay, so let me put that in the chat, because it's a bit of a tongue twister with that double negative in there, but he says this. Also, God cannot even be thought not to exist. Okay, and I'm going to try and explain this to you in a simple, straightforward way. So, to be able to be thought not to exist is simply to be the sort of being who you could imagine not existing. Like you could at least form the thought in your mind of a possible scenario where that being doesn't exist. And Anselm thinks that God is too great to even be thought of as non-existent. So why is he incapable of being thought that way? Because if he could be thought not to exist, that would be a flaw. That would be something that's a deficiency. That would detract from his perfect greatness. So let's try and understand a comparison of two things side by side. On the one hand, we have things that can be thought not to exist. Like, okay, you see this marker in my hand? What if I set it on fire, turned it into ash, and just scattered it to the wind? Then this marker would no longer exist. And we can imagine that, even though clearly it's here for the moment. And not just the marker, but any other thing. Even the planet Earth. We can imagine a scenario in which the planet Earth gets destroyed by the supernova of the sun, or like a passing asteroid hits it or something. So things in this world and in this universe can, in most all cases, be imagined not to exist. But on the other hand, he says God is something that's way greater than all those things. And so God should not be able to be thought of as non-existent. Or at least if he could be, then that would mean he's not the greatest conceivable being. So since it's greater to be incapable of being thought not to exist than it is to be able to be thought not to exist, God, therefore, must not be able to be thought not to exist. I mean, it's a bit of a tongue twister, so you gotta have to say it a few times. God can't be thought not to exist. So I'll say it a few different ways. The thought that God doesn't exist, he's telling you that's not possible. It's not even possible to have that thought in the mind, because it would stand as a mark against God's perfection and greatness. So that's an additional point, because the first step of the argument was to try and show us that God has to really exist in reality. And now he's going a stage further and saying, beyond this, he cannot even be thought not to. Because, again, the possibility of being thought non-existent is less great than when it is impossible to be thought not to exist. And let me read his words on that. There's not much I can do to make that a little less confusing in terms of the wording, because just hear him. He says on page 16, certainly this being so truly exists that it cannot be even thought not to exist. Because something can be thought to exist that cannot be thought not to exist, and this is greater than that which can be thought not to exist. Hence, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not the same as that than which a greater cannot be thought, and that is absurd. Something than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly then that it cannot be even thought not to exist. Okay, now he has a little part where he speaks to God again. He says, and you, Lord God, are this being. You exist so truly, Lord God, that you cannot even be thought not to exist. And this is as it should be. Because if some intelligence could think of something better than you, then the creature would be above the creator and would judge the creator, and that is totally absurd. In fact, everything else there is, except for you alone, can be thought of as not existing. You alone, then, God, of all things, most truly exist, and therefore of all things possess existence to the highest degree, because anything else does not exist as truly and so possesses existence to a lesser degree. So why then did the fool say in his heart there is no God, when it is so evident to any rational mind that you of all things exist to the highest degree? Why indeed, unless because he was stupid and a fool. Wow, okay, that's not a good way to say it, but Anselm, the classic theist that writes the Ontological Argument, has got some charged language there for our atheist friends. But one last point remains in his discussion that we can talk about before I close for today. You might be wondering then, and he has to grapple with this, he's just now argued that that God cannot even be thought not to exist. But how is that supposed to be reconciled with the evident existence of atheists who say of themselves, I don't think God exists, right? He's saying that's not even possible to think. So how can we tie those two loose ends together? Here's what he says. It's an interesting and it's a clever move. He says, okay, so people who are non-believers, the atheists, or as he calls them, the fool, they say they don't believe in God, right? But Anselm argues that that idea is not impossible to think. And so in his view, when the atheist thinks there's no God, they must be thinking of something different from God. Even if they use the same word in their speech or in their thought, they're not attaching it to the correct concept. So like if I said to you, hey, check out this awesome cat, and I'm showing you the marker, you'd be like, this man does not really know what the word cat refers to. He's using it in reference to a marker, so he's all confused. And so Anselm thinks that atheists, when they say there's no quote-unquote God, they're using the word with a different definition. And that's the only reason that it doesn't really count as a thought that the real God does not exist. You see, it's a thought that God, in quotes, doesn't exist, where that word refers to something lesser than God, because again, he's really adamant on the point that God is way too great. He's the greatest conceivable being. So there's not even the possibility for him to be thought of as non-existent. And so essentially, he's telling you that atheists don't even have the idea of God in their mind when they think they're thinking about God. So their thoughts that God does not exist fail to count as real thoughts that the actual God doesn't exist. Here, let me read his words on that, and then that'll be good for today. We'll pick up with this on Friday. He says, how indeed has he said in his heart what he could not think? Or how could he not think what he said in his heart, since to say in one's heart and to think are the same? But if he really both thought because he said in his heart, and did not say in his heart because he could not think, then there is not only one sense in which something is said in one's heart or thought. Okay, now here's the key part. Because in one sense, a thing is thought when the word signifying it is thought. In another sense, when the very object which the thing is understood. So in the first sense then, when you're just thinking about the word, but not the idea, in that sense, God can be thought not to exist, but not at all in the second sense, when you're thinking of the real thing. He says, no one, indeed, understanding what God is, can think that God does not exist, even though he may say those words in his heart, either without any meaning or with a different meaning. Because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Whoever really understands this understands clearly that this same being so exists, that not even in thought can it not exist. Thus, whoever understands that God exists in such a way cannot think of him as not existing. And so he closes saying, I give thanks, Lord, give thanks to you, since what I believed before through your free gift, I now understand through your illumination. So that's how he wraps up his discussion there of the ontological argument. So I know we're coming to the close here, and let me just say a few points of summary before I dismiss you guys. So St. Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, who lived in the 11th century, he's made an argument that God exists. It's not based on empirical evidence. It's based on definitions and concepts alone. His first move is to call out what kind of being is God believed to be. And he says we can all agree, at least, whether we're theists or atheists, we can agree that the definition of that word is greatest conceivable being. okay, so the next point is that some things are only in the mind, like a leprechaun or a fairy, and then there's some things that are in the mind and in reality, like the Eiffel Tower, Danny DeVito chair, or whatever else. And he's saying to you that the things that are in both mind and in reality, they have more existence, and so they're greater than the things that only exist in the mind. Given the idea that God is the greatest conceivable being, he would therefore have to exist in both. Otherwise, it would contradict that he's the greatest. Now, on top of that, he says God can't even be thought not to exist, because if he could be thought not to exist, that would also count against his perfection and greatness, and it would be the case then that the greatest conceivable being is lesser than something. So he can't even be thought not to exist. Beyond having to exist, he can't even be thought not to. And so finally he says, in the words and thoughts of atheists who say of themselves, I don't believe in God, according to Anselm, no, you don't think that, because you don't really have the correct idea of God, and so your thoughts don't correspond to the belief that there's no God. And that's why he says it's not even possible for anyone to have such thoughts. If they could, then that would detract from God's greatness, which again, he says can't happen. So that's what I had for you guys today. It's our first move to just learn about the ontological argument, but next class on Friday, we'll start to learn about objections. If you found something a little weird or funny about this argument, or you had some skepticism, then hang in there and stay tuned. And on Friday, you'll learn about how people have found fault with the argument. Like, what have people found deficient or unsatisfying about this attempt to prove God's existence? Certainly there have been critics, and we're going to learn about what they've said too. So I guess for now, I'll let you guys go. Feel free to say goodbye, and then I'll close the stream. I'll send you this recorded lecture later today, and I'll also send you the link for the Friday lecture as well as the office hour link for Friday. And then, of course, we'll see each other in person next week, but this week is virtual. So thanks, guys. Thanks so much. I appreciate your attendance. So have a good day. I'll see you then. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, thanks again. See you soon.